The end of Nimrod was not death, it was transformation. For there are falls that do not end in oblivion, but in the birth of something even more powerful, legend. When the ground opened beneath his feet and the shadows claimed his body, they did not swallow him like a mere mortal. They devoured him as one devours a symbol. The hunter's final roar was not of despair or defeat. It was a fiery echo that crashed against the vaults of the sky, an eternal whisper that seemed to say, "This is not over." Those who witnessed his disappearance did not know whether to weep or tremble. Some fled in terror, others fell to their knees, not out of reverence for the heavens, but because of the void his departure left. Yet his name was not erased. On the contrary, it began to multiply, like a seed fallen on fertile ground. At every frontier, his story took on a different form. For some, he was the first rebel. For others, a martyr of human ambition. And for many, an entity halfway between God and demon. But no one dared deny it. Nimrod existed, and with him was born the archetype of the man who challenges God with empty hands and still dares to build towers toward infinity. 2. The shadow that crosses the centuries. Nimrod disappeared from the sight of men, but his shadow did not dissolve with the passage of time. On the contrary, it grew, expanded, becoming a persistent whisper in the dark corners of every empire that arose afterward. For every civilization that dared to look toward the stars, that dreamed of dominating beyond its natural limits, bore within its foundations something of Nimrod, as if his spirit, far from being destroyed, had been released to infiltrate the ambition of kings, emperors, conquerors. The desert sages said that his name was never forgotten but fragmented into 1,000 new names, that Nimrod walked under other faces, that his burning gaze hid behind different crowns, that his voice continued to resonate in the speeches of those who promised to elevate man above the divine. From Babylon to Rome, from Mesopotamian ziggurats to Egyptian obelisks, his symbol reappeared time and again. Towers, fire, kingdoms that defied the heavens, visions that sought eternity. In the secret scrolls of mystics, some claimed that Nimrod never died, that his body was transfigured, that the shadows enveloped him to preserve him, not to punish him, and that one day he will return, not as a king of flesh, but as an incarnate idea, the absolute man, the conqueror of tongues, the unifier of lost kingdoms, the one who will gather under a single scepter that which was scattered in Babel. Others said that his fall was so colossal that it broke the cycles of time, and therefore his story repeats eternally. In every century, in every civilization that prides itself too much, that attempts to rise above the sacred, Nimrod reappears. Not with his name, but with his ambition, with his defiant gaze, and his hand extended toward the throne of heaven. And thus, his shadow crosses the centuries not as a specter, but as a spiritual inheritance. For as long as there exists a man who looks to the firmament and says, "I can reach higher," the essence of Nimrod will remain alive. He needs no body, no city. He lives in every unfinished tower, in every empire that roars against the divine, in every human attempt to become eternal through his own hands. 3. Babel, the legacy of the defied heavens. The tower was left behind, like an open scar on the earth, a petrified echo of the moment humanity dared to challenge the sacred. No one finished its construction. No one could claim its summit. And yet, its legacy was not oblivion. It was dispersion. Babel did not disappear. It became a seed buried in the human psyche, a warning and a longing, a myth and a mirror. The peoples who fled the chaos carried with them more than new tongues. They carried the memory. Their stories included the image of a tower that sought to reach God. They told it to their children as a tale explaining the origin of their languages. Yes, but also as a hidden warning. Something had happened there that humanity should never repeat, and yet could never resist trying again. Because the Tower of Babel, more than a structure, was an act, a collective gesture, an eternal symbol of humanity's urge to transcend its condition. The clay from which it was built was molded with the dreams of men, their desire to transcend, to not be forgotten, to forge a unity that would make them invincible. But that same dream became their punishment. God did not destroy the tower. What he did was subtler and more devastating. He unraveled the word, the understanding, the bond that made agreement possible. And without that invisible thread, the structure collapsed from within, without the need for a single bolt of lightning. Throughout the centuries, many empires would repeat the gesture. Babylon would raise its hanging gardens as a new attempt to restore lost greatness. Egypt would raise pyramids, not toward the heavens, but from the silence of eternity. Greece would try through thought. Rome, with the power of its law and its sword, and all of them, in one way or another, followed Babel's shadow, seeking unity, a perfect order, a single language, a total vision. Without realizing, they were repeating a pattern carved from the beginning. In Jewish mystical tradition, some taught that Babel was also a breach, a fracture point in reality where heaven and earth touched, not in harmony, but in confrontation. That place, they said, remains latent. It cannot be found on maps, but it manifests in moments of greatest human pride, when a civilization believes it no longer needs God. Then the spirit of Babel awakens. The echo of Babel also lives in language. The fragmentation of tongues was not just a barrier to communication, it was the creation of separate worlds. For with each language came a different way of seeing the universe, of naming the sacred, of understanding existence. Perfect unity was lost, and with it, the possibility of a humanity that spoke with one voice. The dispersion was more than geographical, it was ontological. However, that loss also sowed something, the desire to reunite, to find a new common tongue, a new tower, a new order, and that longing has been the secret engine of history, in the technology that seeks to connect the entire planet, in religions that dream of redeeming the world, in ideologies that promise to unite peoples once again. All of them, deep down, are trying to rebuild Babel, and perhaps unknowingly, they are repeating its mistake. 4. The rebellion of an immortal soul. Nimrod did not die in the tower, nor was he forgotten. His flesh was not consumed by tar, nor buried beneath the rubble of collapse. No. Nimrod rose from the wreckage of his fall like a persistent specter, a flame that neither wind nor time could extinguish. Where others saw punishment, he saw a challenge. Where others scattered, he rebuilt his throne with harder stone and hotter fire. Humiliation did not break him, it transmuted him. Because Nimrod, even without the favor of God, possessed a trait that not even the angels could replicate, the stubbornness of man. From the city of Nineveh, founded upon the ruins of pride, the hunter began to weave his web again. No longer with promises of shared glory, but with a rule of iron fist. The conqueror who once spoke of unity now demanded obedience. His voice thundered. He did not request loyalty, he seized it. It was said that his gaze burned hotter than pitch, and that his scepter not only commanded but dictated fate. And he was not alone. Under his command, dark priests began to appear, men who spoke with serpents and dreamed of dead stars. Men who did not worship, they invoked. In deep chambers beneath temples, words were spun that were never meant to be uttered, words in tongues older than confusion, tongues that Babel could not erase, tongues that did not merely communicate, but summoned. Nimrod had understood a terrible truth. If heaven was unreachable through matter, it must be reached through the soul. So his search began, a hidden, silent, yet burning quest. He no longer sought to build towers. Now he wished to transcend flesh, to conquer not only the earth, but the invisible structures. What had been a rebellion of bricks became a spiritual heresy, an attempt to break the very architecture of the universe. The sages of the East said Nimrod was no longer entirely human, that he could sit for hours without blinking, contemplating star maps that only he understood, that he spoke with statues, and they replied, that shadows stretched longer when he passed by, as if even light hesitated to confront him. It was as if the soul of the hunter had been reconfigured, marked by its contact with the divine, not as a chosen one, but as an antagonist. Because no one defies heaven and returns unchanged. The ancient Sumerian scribes, whose texts now crumble on cracked tablets, called him he who does not bow. Others recorded him as he who cried out to the firmament. And still others, the most fearful, named him simply the first. And that title bore a prophetic weight. For in a sense, Nimrod was just that, the first to build an empire with the conscious intent of defying God. The first to oppose, not out of ignorance, but out of pride. The first to look at the Creator and say, "It is not enough to exist under your rules. I will make my own." And do we not still walk beneath his shadow? Every system that seeks to abolish the sacred, every ideology that presents itself as the new God, every modern tower erected in the name of human power, all of them, in some form, are heirs to the fire that once burned in Nimrod's chest. But there is more. Some sages say Nimrod did not die, that his body vanished, yes, but that his spirit was sealed, that his soul, flammable and eternal, was trapped between dimensions, not as punishment, but as a warning, because his story is not over, because every cycle needs an echo, and perhaps, one day, when the world once again speaks a single language, when the final digital or ideological tower is raised to replace God, Nimrod will return, not with a sword, but with a single gaze, to complete the rebellion that once began with bricks and ended in flames. And then, the soul that refused to be either man or God will once again choose its destiny. 5. The judgment of the first heavens. Not every judgment begins with a decree. Some begin with a murmur, with a subtle vibration in the invisible pillars of the universe. And when Nimrod challenged not only men or nations, but the very structure of heaven, something ancient awoke. Not an immediate response, not a tempestuous rage, but the slow, inevitable descent of the eternal upon the temporal. Scripture speaks of a God who watches, who is silent, who permits, but also of a God who in certain moments descends, not to destroy, but to correct the very axis of reality. The tale of Nimrod, then, was not merely a human rebellion. It was a disruption, a distortion in the sacred line that separates the created from the Creator. And when that line is stretched too far, judgment is not far behind. But this was not a judgment like those of the past, not like the flood, which swept away flesh, not like the fire of Sodom, which scorched the earth. This judgment was subtler, more absolute, a judgment without words, without lightning, without trumpets, a readjustment in the very fabric of the cosmos. Because Nimrod had touched the unnameable, he had forced the veil, he had shouted upward, and the heights had heard. The ancient apocryphal texts, banned, hidden, buried in caves and sealed in forgotten tongues, speak of this judgment differently, not as punishment, but as balance. They say that when man dares to rise as God, the heavens do not send angels, they send truths. And those truths, when revealed all at once, shatter the mind, the soul, the language, the purpose. And so it happened. The people who once built together could no longer understand even each other's names. Commands turned to noise, prayers to incoherence. It was as though the universe had taken a step back, leaving humanity in a night devoid of meaning. That was the true judgment, not a blow, but a rupture of the sacred link that connected man's consciousness to the eternal word. The wise understood that unity is a fragile blessing, and that when it is used as a platform for arrogance, it becomes its own curse. Nimrod had tried to touch heaven, but in doing so, he severed the invisible strings that connected the peoples to the word. And without the word, there is no communion. Without communion, there is no creation. Without creation, only chaos remains. From the heavens, the higher intelligences, thrones, Ophanim, Hayat HaKodesh, did not intervene as warriors. They acted as guardians of the eternal order, for the Tower of Babel was not destroyed by violence, but by disalignment. Judgment came as a change of axis, as a spiritual earthquake that shifted the world's trajectory to save it from itself. And thus, what was one became many. Languages, tribes, nations, cultures. Diversity was not a punishment, it was a shield. And yet Nimrod's soul was not erased, because God's judgment does not always mean extinction. Sometimes it means preservation in exile. Nimrod was swallowed by the earth, not as one who dies, but as one who is sealed, as one who becomes a witness, as one who must be remembered not for his defeat, but for his warning. The first heavens, those that existed before the records, before the covenants, before the visible angels, keep in their archives the echo of that cry, the cry of a man who looked at the infinite and did not tremble. And that echo still vibrates, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what happens when creation forgets it was created, of what happens when man forgets that his glory is not in equaling God, but in walking with him. The elders of Revelation, the seraphim who never cease to cry, "Holy, holy, holy," still watch. They know the story of Nimrod has not concluded, because the true judgment is not to punish sin, but to reveal its boundary. But this was not a judgment like those of the past, not like the flood, which swept away flesh, not like the fire of Sodom, which scorched the earth. This judgment was subtler, more absolute, a judgment without words, without lightning, without trumpets, a readjustment in the very fabric of the cosmos. Because Nimrod had touched the unnameable, he had forced the veil, he had shouted upward, and the heights had heard. The ancient apocryphal texts, banned, hidden, buried in caves, and sealed in forgotten tongues, speak of this judgment differently, not as punishment, but as balance. They say that when man dares to rise as God, the heavens do not send angels, they send truths, and those truths, when revealed all at once, shatter the mind, the soul, the language, the purpose. And so it happened. The people who once built together could no longer understand even each other's names. Commands turned to noise, prayers to incoherence. It was as though the universe had taken a step back, leaving humanity in a night devoid of meaning. That was the true judgment, not a blow, but a rupture of the sacred link that connected man's consciousness to the eternal word. The wise understood that unity is a fragile blessing, and that when it is used as a platform for arrogance, it becomes its own curse. Nimrod had tried to touch heaven, but in doing so, he severed the invisible strings that connected the peoples to the word. And without the word, there is no communion. Without communion, there is no creation. Without creation, only chaos remains. From the heavens, the higher intelligences, thrones, Ophanim, Hayot HaKodesh, did not intervene as warriors. They acted as guardians of the eternal order. For the Tower of Babel was not destroyed by violence, but by disalignment. Judgment came as a change of axis, as a spiritual earthquake that shifted the world's trajectory to save it from itself. And thus what was one became many. Languages, tribes, nations, cultures. Diversity was not a punishment, it was a shield. And yet, Nimrod's soul was not erased, because God's judgment does not always mean extinction. Sometimes it means preservation in exile. Nimrod was swallowed by the earth, not as one who dies, but as one who is sealed, as one who becomes a witness, as one who must be remembered not for his defeat, but for his warning. The first heavens, those that existed before the records, before the covenants, before the visible angels, keep in their archives the echo of that cry, the cry of a man who looked at the infinite and did not tremble. And that echo still vibrates, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what happens when creation forgets it was created, of what happens when man forgets that his glory is not in equaling God, but in walking with him. The elders of Revelation, the seraphim who never cease to cry, "Holy, holy, holy," still watch. They know the story of Nimrod has not concluded, because the true judgment is not to punish sin, but to reveal its boundary. And that boundary was the tower, a tower that is still rising today, in every system that denies the transcendent, in every ideology that exalts man as the center, in every algorithm that replaces the soul. But judgment is not fear. It is opportunity, a warning wrapped in compassion, a veil that falls, not to darken, but to reveal. The tower fell. Nimrod disappeared, but the question remains, will we build again? Will we raise towers? Or will we learn to lift our eyes? Epilogue: The shadow of the tower. The tower was left behind. Its ruins are dust, its bricks bones of time, and yet it still stands, not on earth, but in the heart of man, because the Tower of Babel was not merely a structure, it was an archetype. An idea, a mirror in which humanity sees itself when it forgets heaven. Every generation has tried to build it again. With steel, with science, with pride, with control. In every empire, in every ideology that denies the invisible, in every city that rises as a god and forgets its soul. And each time, the result is the same. Confusion, division, silence. Because the judgment of Babel was not just a past event. It was an eternal warning. When man forgets his limit, creation itself reminds him who he is. But deep within that warning, there is also hope. Because if the tower fell, it was so we would learn to look upward again, not with arrogance, but with wonder, not with hands that impose, but with hearts that seek, and perhaps someday, when men no longer wish to be gods, but to walk with them, when language is reunited not by power, but by truth, then the ruins will no longer be ruins. They will become roots, and from that forgotten soil, something new will bloom, not a tower, but a tree whose branches do not defy the heavens, but give shade to those who long for them. Until then, Nimrod will be remembered, not as an enemy, but as a warning, as memory, and the tower will keep whispering to those brave enough to listen. The return of the invisible core. Will the pre-angelic beings be revealed at the end of time? At the heart of every spiritual tradition, no matter how diverse or distant it may seem, there is always a constant. The end times are not merely a conclusion, but a revelation, an unveiling, a moment when what was hidden will be seen, not as a grand spectacle for the senses, but as an absolute truth that will collapse false perceptions. And among everything that might be revealed in that final instant, there exists a possibility barely brushed by theology, that the pre-angelic beings, those who never fell, never spoke, never intervened, will be manifested to the universe as the hidden pillars upon which everything was built. Imagine this scenario. In the moment when heaven and earth pass away, as the book of Revelation prophesies, when the corruptible vanishes and only the eternal remains, structures will appear to the eye that were never seen by humans, nor contemplated by angels. Not because they didn't exist, but because their function was invisible by nature, too essential, too intimate to God to be revealed before the appointed time. Revelation speaks of a throne surrounded by living beings, elders who cast their crowns, and 7 spirits of God shining like lamps. But there are moments in the text where John falls silent, as if he saw more than he could or was allowed to describe. A presence unnamed, a vision unspoken, a knowledge that, even in the midst of the greatest revelation, remains veiled. What did John see and not say? What presence was so absolute it could only be sensed, not explained? Some Kabbalists and Christian mystics have suggested that at the end of time, not only will Christ return, not only will justice be restored, but the hidden name of God will once again be spoken in its complete form. That name which is in no language, which cannot be spoken aloud, which cannot be written. A name that, according to some Hebrew traditions, was shared only with the first conscious beings, the silent witnesses of the abyss before time. And here emerges the powerful connection. If the lost name, the complete name, was known only by the pre-angelic beings, then its revelation also implies their return, or their manifestation. It would be a convergence. The final word, the final seal, will not be a spoken phrase but a revealed structure. An eternal pattern that was always there, but which only at the end may be seen. In the most esoteric writings of the Jewish tradition, such as the Sefer Raziel and certain hidden layers of the Zohar, there is a deep teaching that every creative act of God left a structural resonance, a kind of spiritual mold embedded in the fabric of the universe. And these molds, these eternal blueprints, are conscious beings, not abstract ideas. They are forms of existence that do not think or choose but vibrate with unchanging will. One of these texts declares, "When the final veil is torn, there will be no sound or vision, but only the presence of those who were before the beginning and who will be after the end." Those are the pre-angelic beings, not functional presences, but the living architecture of the eternal. The Zohar teaches that the physical world is just a crust, a shell. What matters is what lies beneath, what has always remained in silence. And that in the end days, When the tree of life is restored in its fullness, the channels that sustain the infinite light will be visibly perceived by elevated souls. And what if the Ophanim, the thrones, the Yehidim, the Hayot HaKodesh, and others yet unnamed are those channels? And what if seeing them will not be like witnessing an angel descending from the sky, but like seeing for the first time the complete design of the universe, the sacred geometry that always sustained us, revealed as being, not as symbol? This would not be a theatrical appearance. They will not descend with trumpets. They will be revealed because there will no longer be a veil between the visible and the invisible. And in that instant, we will understand that they were never hidden. We were the ones who were blind. But this revelation will not be for all. According to the ancients, only those who have elevated their consciousness, only those who have attuned their soul to divine silence, will be able to recognize the first ones. Not because they are hidden, but because their language is not visual or verbal. It is structural. It is pure presence. Some Gnostic texts speak of this moment as the return of the unfallen thought. That is, the restoration of the spiritual memory that there once was a prior order, a structural purity, an intelligence that needs no movement to be alive. And that thought manifests not in ideas, but in beings. Perhaps that is the true apocalypse, not destruction, but the removal of illusory layers. The end is not the end. It is the seeing, finally. Seeing what always was. Seeing the first ones, the ones who sustain, the ones who turn, the ones who burn, the ones who never spoke but never stopped speaking. And when that happens, humankind will understand its true place. Not at the peak of creation, but between the created who seeks and the eternal who sustains. Because in the beginning they were there, and in the end, they will be too.